London Blue presents, and today I'm presenting you with the art of editing. Why? Because we're all human. We all need a little help in editing, and we all make mistakes. So I'd like to thank my guests for being here with me today. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it so much. And let's just jump on into it. If you would, kindly introduce yourself and tell us how you got into editing. Manny, would you like to go first?
Sure. I was a college composition instructor for a long time. So that is the boot camp of learning to do English editing. And after that, I was a poetry editor for a number of years, and I've written some poetry. And I still have a tendency, like everybody else in the world does, to screw up when I write stuff and have to read it 3 or 4 times. So it never gets old.
Yes, I had a professor over at West Virginia State in a poetry class, and he had been working on the same poem for like 2 years, and he had yet to let his wife even read it. And I'm thinking, dude, 2 years on one poem? Maybe you need to switch subjects or something.
He was lucky that he had a wife who would read his poetry.
Well, he wouldn't let her read it. Katie, would you like to go next?
Sure. I actually have always loved writing. I was, I won some awards like in high school and stuff for my poetry. So when I got to college, I wanted to do something in the writing field, but I wanted it to also be something I could do that had a business with it. So I actually went into publishing and studied. So I actually have a degree in publishing. So I've kind of had my hand in every bit of it. And I was able to get a job at a newspaper right out of school and worked at a newspaper for several years. And I still do some freelancing for them at times. So I have that experience. But back I've always kind of dabbled a little bit. Like I've had friends and people work on their school papers and stuff doing editing. But back in 2017 was really where it started taking off, because I had a book that I wanted published, and I wrote a book for my youngest adoption. I've adopted all 3 of my kids, and for the youngest one, I wrote a book, and I entered it into a contest to win an adoption grant, and then I was able to get it published. And after I published it, the COO of the company, who also happens to be a good friend of mine, said, "Hey, while you're here, do you think you might want to do some editing for us?" And so that's where it really started taking off, where I was getting a lot of editing jobs from them. And it's helped by freelance business. So I do a lot of freelance editing, but I'm also the senior editor for the Christian publishing house that published my book. So, and now I oversee about 10 other freelance editors as well. And still trying to write. I'm still on my writing journey, but I'm helping other people with theirs. So I love it.
That's awesome. And the whole adoption and that's awesome in itself. That's great.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
And the fact that your book won an award for that.
Well, it was a grant. So it was so money for our adoption, and that's kind of where it all started. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Awesome. Renee, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I am Renee DeCamillis. I'm not just an editor, but I'm also an author, a dark fiction and horror author. And I'm also the lead singer and rhythm guitarist and songwriter for the band Scars Aligned. So I do a lot of writing. I think that's really what led me into editing, was because of writing. I mean, I got to edit my own stuff all the time, and really trying to learn how to edit my own stuff. And in grad school, I did my MFA and did a lot of workshopping. And I think that's really where I got the first idea that I might want to do editing, because, when I give feedback to, my classmates, everybody loved my feedback. Like I couldn't not line edit. It's just ingrained in my brain to just, I can't even read something for enjoyment without being like, oh, wait, no, they missed punctuation there, or they have a wrong punctuation here. And it's kind of a sickness. And when I was an undergrad, I worked on the Words and Images literary journal, but that was more like slush reading, not really editing, not really polishing up the manuscripts. But I currently do freelance work. But my main gig is I'm working with an indie publisher, Wicked House Publishing. And that came about through, I was doing intern work with Crystal Lake Publishing, where I was an editorial intern for 2 years. And when it came time for me to look for a paying job, I asked Joe for a letter of recommendation, and he's like, hey, well, I'll give you a letter of recommendation, but I also know a new indie horror publisher looking for an editor. So I put in a good word for you, and it worked out. I'm editing for Wicked House now. So, and I love it. I mean, it helps me with my own writing, and I just like helping people get their books ready, and they get all excited when they get it back, and and just getting thanked for helping them polish their. It just feels good to help people. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, and to be able to get paid for doing it too.
Well, yeah, that's a plus.
That's great. Okay, Michael, you're up.
Well, I actually started when I was working in broadcasting for probably 35 years. I managed radio stations and worked in television, also worked in newspaper. And I really actually had no desire at all when it came to books or anything like that. But eventually, I started doing that and actually started writing first, and wanted to do some anthologies. So I edited some anthologies as probably more as an anthologist than an editor, but you're titled as the editor. And one of the things that I found that I had I guess it's because of working in broadcasting for as long as I have, and the shortest medium that you could find is a 30-second radio commercial or a 30-second television commercial. And so if you're able to tell a story within 30 seconds, you're doing good, I think. And so, going into the longer mediums as far as writing goes, and whether it's a short story or if it's a novel or whatever the case may be, I find that the longer it is, the easier it gets. But I also found that I had a knack for making or finding problems with stories more than anything. And if you do this instead of this, maybe you go here at this point. Because I saw a whole lot of times where writers would present a story or submit a story, and it wasn't even a story because it didn't have the elements that is needed for it to be a story. And so once being able to show them what I was talking about, then they could really knock it out of the park. And I, for years, get to work as a mentor for the HWA, and I was the chair for the HWA for the mentorship program. And being a mentor is a whole lot like being an editor, because you're helping and someone guiding them in their writing. And so as an editor or as a mentor, there's no greater there's no greater feeling in the world than to be able to help someone who is right now where you started, and you've kind of learned all the hard tricks and so forth, and being able to get them turned around and pointed in the right direction, and then you get to see them soar. And I have a number of authors that over the years I've been very blessed to be able to help, and I see them doing wonderful, wonderful things. Some are some pretty big names right now, and I would rather see that than to receive awards. I mean, it's just it's that fulfilling, I guess you can say. So, and there's a lot of different aspects, and I think you're probably going to touch into this, but there's a lot of different aspects of editing itself, whether it's copy editing or submersive, different elements. But I tend to love being the story doctor and helping to lead, with the story, and helping the writer unveil their potential is probably my favorite part of doing it.
Great. Yeah, great. And I imagine, yes, seeing one of the authors that you've helped become successful, I imagine that is a great award of itself. Reward, award, kind of the same thing with same feeling in that particular case. You mentioned story elements, that there are certain story elements that are required for it to be a complete story. Would you, or any of you, want to hit on, I know this one was kind of out of the box, but would anyone want to elaborate on that a little bit to give our writers a little tip?
Well, what I was talking about is particularly talking about genre or commercial fiction. You have to have someone in your story, which is your main character, and you want them to want something, and then you also have someone or something that's going to get in their way of that want, and so then you're going to have action that's going on, and what I call is story action, and story action is directly related to the conflict. And if you don't have that, if you don't have the conflict, then you don't have a story. And of course, then you have to have the resolution, which means, they either get the want or they don't get the want. Those are the basic sequels of now, literary fiction can be a little bit different, where literary fiction could be more character driven, a character study. So when you're talking about genre fiction, until you have someone who wants something, and then someone or something that's standing in their way, your story doesn't begin, for one thing. And not only do you not have a story, but it doesn't begin, and you can't really even end the story until you get the resolution of that. So those are just really basic items, and
that makes sense.
Surprised. I've been really surprised over the years. I've edited magazines, I've edited literally dozens of anthologies, and it's amazing to me the number of people who they want to write. They have the love of writing. They want to do it so badly, but yet submitting a story and goes nowhere. Now there's a whole lot more intricacies as far as the elements of the story, but those are the bones. I would say.
It's definitely more than just a beginning, middle, and end.
Yes.
Michael, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. when you're speaking, you're kind of breaking up a little bit.
Hang on one second.
Manny, I'm going to go ahead and ask you on that same topic, because he was talking more specifically about stories, that there are certain elements that a story has to have before it's a complete story. I know you do more with poetry, and I know there's all kinds of different types of poems. So, I mean, we probably don't have, maybe we could do another podcast and have you back on and just talk about just different types of poems. But in general, what would you need to say that your poem is complete?
Oh,
I mean, all of the same elements.
you know, Tammy, I think you need an awful lot of arrogance to say that your poem is complete. All right. Or alternately, you've just finished it and it's glorious. It's so much better than you thought it was going to be. You know, you're not going to have to change a thing ever. And everybody's going to love it. And you're going to be beloved by everyone. And, you know, your fairy grandmother's going to come down and put a little crown on your head. And it's going to be, and give you the bouquet. And then, you know, you will be Poet Teenager of the Year. And it's all fabulous after that. And that happens sometimes, I've heard. I understand. But after a while, when you're, one of my very favorite poets is an English poet. Actually, he's a Scottish poet named Don Patterson. And one of his sayings, he's a very grumpy guy now. One of his favorite sayings now is, first idea, worst idea. So that's an awful thing to say to anybody. But as you get on with the business in, you know, your own writing life of writing and editing and finding that people are not satisfied sometimes, or they want something different or something more, and having to change and change again. And it's like, well, I like this, but I'll try changing it. And then the changes become new basic elements of what you're writing. You find out that sometimes, in some ways, the editing almost becomes as important and creative and more determinant than that original, you know, drafting and plotting sometimes. So
yeah, now see, I was kind of, I'm gonna throw myself under the bus.
Sure. Don't do that. Don't do that.
I was actually one of those people who, if I wrote a poem and if it flowed, and you know, when you get on a roll and it just boom, 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 and it flows, and there's rhythm, and I prefer rhyming poetry. We've talked about that on other podcasts.
Yeah, me too.
But if it rhymes and the rhythm is there and it just flowed, you know, so easily, then I'll be like, dude, I'm done. It sounds beautiful. And yes, that is one thing that I did learn in that poetry class. He forced me to edit and re-edit and re-edit one particular poem. And it was a poem of my choice. He wasn't picking on my writing. You know, he had the whole class. He pulled out one poem that you had written, and he made us write like 3 different revisions of it. But exactly, throughout those revisions, not only did I realize the original poem maybe wasn't as good as it could have been, but I ended up getting 3 additional poems out of it.
Excellent.
3 different thoughts, 3 different ideas. So
that guy still sounds like a sadist, you know. But I mean, even so.
Renee, do you or Katie have anything you want to add to that before we go on to the next question?
Well, I just like to say that, like, you know, I joke a lot about my own writing, you know, with, you know, when, you know, you get the first draft down and you think it's great. But then when you go back and you do the revisions and the editing, that's when you can go back and make it sound like you knew what you were doing right from the beginning. Because everybody makes mistakes on, you know, you can, like Manny said, it's never really complete, you know, and it's one of those things that all writers need to learn. Like, oh, but I love this line. Do I really have to change it? It's like, you got to learn how to be okay with killing your babies, you know, like, and I think you learn a lot through the editing and the revision process as a writer. So
Absolutely.
it's just as important as the writing part. It's all part of the writing. Like I hear many writers say like, oh, I got it done. And it's like, well, now I have to edit it. It's like, I enjoy editing it because then that's polishing it and you make it all nice and shiny and ready for the world, you know?
Right. And you mentioned that there's always that one line that you absolutely love. And somebody says, you really need to change that. I don't know how many times my editor, Michelle, and I have gone round and round. She ultimately wins. I put up a fight, but she ultimately wins because she knows better than I do. And she's there to polish my work and help me. So I do end up caving. But yeah, it does sometimes when you think you've got the perfect line, whether poetry or a story, and your editor comes around and whacks the whole line out.
Well, and also I wanted to say too that depending on the person, the writer, and you know how they are as a person, some might take offense or take it personal, you know, because they love that part so much, and it's like it's nothing against you or your creation. It's like you can't take it personal. It's like your editor wants your work to be the best it can be, you know. And you know. Writers just need to have a tough skin and realize that editors want you to succeed. They want your work to be good, you know?
Exactly. I had invited my editor, Michelle, on with us, but she's grading papers and trying to edit a book, and she's just got so much piled up right now. So she couldn't be here with us this evening. But yes, I don't take her editing, her critique personally. In fact, because she has been editing my books, we've become pretty good friends. And she comes to my events and everything, and we've developed a friendship. And same with Manny. I met him. He was actually my mentor through the Horror Writers Association. That's how I met him. So,
and I gave Tammy a kidney.
Aww.
You know, you were talking about that beautiful line that you love so much and so forth. There's an old adage that if you're in love with it, you really got to look at it more than anything else, because if you love it, there's really something wrong with it, you know. And that's something that I remember when the first writing workshop that I went to. It was in Kansas, and it was a two-week writers workshop at Kansas University. And James Gunn, the legendary James Gunn, was running the program. And there were so many other people. By the way, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure now. Okay, good. I changed microphones. It was the first time anyone really had read my work, and I remember sitting there and everyone was reading through, it was the Milford style workshop. And so everyone was going around in the circle and they were talking about the story and what they loved and what they thought could be changed and could be fixed and so forth. And it started out, everyone would read a line that I had written, and they would say that was just so beautiful. That line was just so wonderful. And then, you know, the next person was talking about another line, and I was blown away because I was expecting people to rip it apart. Instead, I have all these people bragging on it and you know, talking about all these lines that they love. And then at the very end, as happens in the Milford style, the pro got to speak, and James Gunn, he said, you know, all those moments where everyone was saying they loved that line, they loved that, they wish that they could write like that. And I was, yeah. And he said, every single time you pulled them out of the story, you pulled the reader out of the story, And what you need to do is you need to be invisible. You don't want them to see how gloriously you write. You want them to stay in the story. You want to keep them in Narnia. You want them to be one of the characters that's following along in the story and experiencing the story. So that was when you guys said that, I had a little chuckle inside, because I remember many years ago learning that, and now as I'm editing my own work, if I look at something and I think, oh, I really like this, this is wonderful. Now I'm a butcher. There's obviously something wrong with it if I love it that much. So it's got to go.
I never thought about that, but that is a very, very valid point and a very good tip. So there you go, writers. If there is a line in your story or poem that you absolutely love that really stands out, maybe take a second, third, fourth, fifth look at it. Katie, is there anything you'd like to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, as well, my children's book is a poem that I wrote, and just speaking to that line, like there was an instance where, I mean, I thought I had that arrogance where I was like, yeah, this is good. This is flowing. This is working. And then when it went to the proofreader, they didn't really edit it, but they had a proofreader, and she was like, didn't you already say this way? And I was like, oh yeah, I did. And so like, even like just, even editors, for one, have to be edited. We don't because you're in your head and you think, surely they know my character had this whole backstory and I don't have to tell them that. And I've been working with several authors now who they forget like that there's not, that the reader's not in your head. They don't know that you built this whole world until you tell them. So you got to kind of, that whole, like with the story elements and and trying to build up a like for your character. You want them to root for your protagonist. You don't want the protagonist to be so obnoxious that they really just want you to kill them off at the end of the story. You want there to be somebody or something that they're rooting for, and building up that conflict, whether it's like an internal conflict or external conflict, and just really making sure that your characters are going somewhere and keeping the story flowing, I think are all essential things. So.
Okay. Yeah, very, very good points. All right. So here's your next question, and it kind of falls in line with what we're already talking about, and it's mistakes that we all make as writers. So as editors, what are the most common mistakes that most authors make?
Not getting an editor. Every time I see like these indie authors who say, well, I don't have the money to get myself an editor, you are making a big, humongous mistake. Because like I was saying, even an editor needs an editor. If you're writing something, back in college, I took a creative writing class, and one of our assignments was to write a play, and I wrote a drama, and it was like so sad. The mom died. It was raining. It was miserable. Everything was so sad. And then some of the people in the class were like supposed to act it out, and they got up to act it out, and everybody thought it was a comedy, and they were laughing. And I was like, this is not exactly the result that I wanted here. So, having somebody outside of you, and not your friends and family, somebody who is going to be really critical and say, hey, this story is not working. I don't really know what's going on here. And then taking their advice. I think, kind of like what Renee said, like, you don't want to let go of things. It's like killing your babies. But if you want to do well and you want to be successful, you have to be open to hearing that outside criticism and taking it to heart and not taking it so personally, and just listening to professionals who know what they're doing and know what works in the industry.
Yeah, definitely good tips. Who else would like to answer that one?
I would
Most
like
common
to just
mistakes.
I would just like to add what Katie said reminded me of, I wasn't editing for this person, but it was a self-published author asked me to be an ARC reader for them and blurb their book. And they had this set publication date. So I'm reading it, but it really needed more editing. But I was only the ARC reader, but I was like, I didn't want the person to publish that without editing it again. And I wasn't going to blurb it. I've never been asked for a blurb before. I don't even have that big of a name. So I was kind of, it made me feel good that they asked for that. But at the same time, I'm like, so I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And I basically said, is there any way you can push back your publication date? Because this is a really great story, but it needs another edit. You need to run through, and I'm more than willing to I was going to help as just a friend, but they're not my friend anymore. And they went through and published it. And so yes, like Katie said, like if you're like for self-published authors, like, yes, get an editor. You got to get an editor because you're going to put that out in the world and you want to put your best work out in the world. I mean, you don't want to put something that's not ready out into the world, because that can just put a big shadow over you. But maybe your next book is really amazing, but people aren't going to buy it or be interested if they read your last book that you didn't really polish up. So yeah, get an editor.
Yeah, I agree. You get pretty much one chance, and if you blow it, you lose a reader, and enough of those, then your kickstart to your career is gone. And so there's a number of things that I see. One is, especially if you're writing short stories for an anthology or so forth, is the blatant dismissal of submission guidelines. And so many writers, I don't know if it's they just don't read them, or if they think that they're so good that the guidelines don't apply to them. But so often I see that so much. And one of the other things too is, so often it's a normal thing, is writers, we tend to mimic those that we love at the very beginning in our career. And so many people are trying to write like Stephen King, or they're trying to write like whoever it is. And the problem is we already have a Stephen King. We already have, a Ray Bradbury. We already have, whoever it would be. So originality, I think, is the thing that you want to not only create your own voice, but you also want to be able to create something that is you. And the story too being original. Don't write a vampire story that everyone else has already done. If you really want to write a vampire story, have your take on it. Do something that's original. Do something that's different, that's never been done before, and do it well. So originality is one of the things, and we hear all the time, and it's true. Everything is already been done. We're just redoing it, and to a degree that is correct. But to write a story that, and I think Manny touched on this too, is on the ending, that the first thing that comes in your mind, usually the reader already has thought of that. And also usually it's already been done 100 times. I'll get an idea and I'll do a quick Google search, and I'm like, yep, I knew I was not the first, I'm not even the second or third to come up with this. But if you come up with an original idea, that is going to be, and you don't have to be a tremendous writer to have success in publishing as a writer. But you do have to have original stories, and you do have to have that, because that's what sells. And a good example of that is the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code, if you go and read the book it's not one of the greatest written, stories ever. But my God, I mean, the story itself is built wonderfully. And and it's original. It's something that we have not seen before. But we also have seen before, but this was a completely different take on it. And because of that, we think of it as we've never seen it before. And I think that's one of the things. I think if writers could, you are going to write like Stephen King if you're a Stephen King fan when you begin, and then you're going to slowly move out of that phase. The sooner you can move out of that phase and be you and tell the stories that you want to tell, number one, the better your story is going to be. And number two, the faster you're going to see success in your writing.
Okay, those are some really good points. And I love the tip about how you Google your idea that you think is original to see if anybody else has got that same thing already out. That's a great tip. Manny, what about you? What do you think are the most common mistakes authors make?
Sorry, I have to go back to think again. Well, one thing I would say is simply that I think that Michael kind of touched on this, especially if you're writing long fiction, and it's all plot-based, and there has to be an element of calculation, thinking about, actions, motivation, motives, and how you're going to plan the revealing of, decisions, consequences. It becomes very elaborate, right? Plot tips on a whole bunch of, do you even do index cards anymore? I forget. But, it becomes really complicated. It becomes a web. It becomes a pattern. But at a certain point, I think Michael, again, touched on this, you find out that in the process of doing the revision, it's not you who is creating the story anymore. It's the story revealing itself as it wants to be. And you get to take credit for it, of course, because you're, a brilliant genius, aren't you now? But what's extraordinary is to find out after the fact that something that was utterly unexpected, something utterly unanticipated, becomes central to how the story works or how the poem works, how that resolution occurs.
Absolutely love it when that happens. And one of my stories in my Mass Mayhem, it took a twist like that, and the dude ran off and got involved with the mob, and I'm like,
what are you doing? I don't know anything about the freaking mob. Now I'm going to have to do even more stupid research.
The one other thing I might just say in a broad way, because I don't know, it strikes me as being legit, is that we all have to remember what Plato. Oh yeah, he was an English teacher, because here comes Plato. Plato said, though, every time we send a piece of writing out into the world, it goes out in the world without us holding its hand. It's an orphan. And without us holding its hand, if we've got, secret, subtle understandings of how the characters work that don't come through the writing, then the people encountering our orphan children aren't going to ever find these things. So as much as we love our vision of the story or our feeling of what the poem is doing, we still have to figure out some way of being public speakers and communicating that to people who don't have a clue about what we're doing.
And those are good points. And all of this really kind of leads into the next question. And some of you have already touched on it a little bit. What do writers do that most annoy editors? What is the most annoying thing a writer can do if you're editing their book or their story or their poem? Anybody?
Not listen. And a writer who I'll give you a quick story, and my stories are never quick, so I apologize. But when I first started as a DJ in radio, when I was really young and I had 3 or 4 more hairs on my head, I remember I recorded myself, and I would send the recording. It was a cassette tape at the time. And I would send it to someone who was a professional. And I was working in a small hometown radio station. And I wanted them to critique. And so they sent back a letter, and it had, I guess, 15, 20 different things that they heard. And they were saying that I should do differently, that I should change. And I read through them, and the further that I read through, the angrier I got. And I was thinking, he has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't know what I have to do at this radio station and so forth. But out of all 20 of these, not one of these even make remotely sense to me. Well, except for this one. And because this one I could see where he's coming from. And then over the course of maybe a week, I was still fuming, Well, I also see on this one too, I can understand what he means with this one. So I'll give him those 2. And then it went from 2 to, oh crap, he's right on every one of these, And so I think when a writer gets really serious and put their ego aside and put themselves aside and put their craft first. And until you're willing to do that, you're not, number one, you're not going to move forward. And second of all, you're never, ever going to succeed whenever you're bucking against your tool, your most valuable tool, and that's your editor. So take the criticism. Even if you're angry about it, don't say anything. I didn't say anything to the guy. And there was a couple of days I was really angry at him. And then later, once I realized he was right. And so when I went into writing and I was looking for a critique, I'd already gone through this through radio. So I wanted real critique. I didn't want anybody patting me on the back and saying this is great or whatever. I wanted people to poke the holes, and show me what I need to know, because obviously when we are at the very beginning stages, we don't know. And that's why these critiques are important. And I talk about critiques in the same sense as what an editor will tell you. And somebody touched on this earlier. Man, there is no one that wants your manuscript to glow and shine any more than the editor. They're not there to try to say I'm better than you. Again, they are a tool. You have tools in your writer's toolbox, and there's no greater tool that you can have than the editor. So listen, pay attention, and even if it's something that you don't agree with, keep quiet about it. Don't make a butt of yourself, and move forward, and really take that criticism to heart, and really think about it, and don't just realize that many times you have a great number of experience behind that critique or behind that edit, and for you to just brush it off because it offended you, or they said your baby was ugly, it's crazy. So,
Michael, I was just thinking though, readers are different and they come from different backgrounds and different perspectives. If you get somebody who really didn't get what you were writing, it might be worth your while to look for another editor, or at least another reader, to get a second opinion. Because, I mean, I think it's a little fearsome sometimes if you get downcast, which is the flip side of the euphoria that you had when you wrote it in the first place. If you get downcast and you start thinking that everybody else has all the right intuitions about what you ought to be doing, well, get another reader to just prompt you with what's working, what's not working, and give yourself a break, because you're doing something extremely daring by putting yourself out there by writing in the first place.
yeah, I agree. And here's the thing, all of the advice that your editor is going to give you I promise you, my editors, I don't take 100% of what they say. It's a give and take thing. And so don't go into it also thinking that your editor, you have to do everything that they say. I'll never forget when I wrote Return of the Mothman. The editor, when I wrote it, it was a short novel, and the editor who was an editor friend of mine, very close friend of mine, who worked for Writer's Digest, in fact, and brilliant writer and editor, and he told me, I really love this, except it's a little short, and maybe you ought to beef this up, and I asked him, well, what needs to be beefed up? What part of the story is not working? And he because I felt like that I don't want to pad a story just to get a word count. I want to make sure that the story is perfect. It's never going to be perfect, but it has to be what I think it should be, and I don't want to add to it just to be adding a word count. And so I didn't take his advice on that, but I took his advice on dozens and dozens of other things in it. And we didn't have an argument or anything like that, but I told him that, I think I'm going to stick with it exactly where it is. And he was very cordial, very nice. And, later, the next year, I think it was, the book was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award. And it is being made into a movie right now from that. And so I saw him about 3 years later. We were out somewhere at a convention or a conference, and he said, "Boy, was I wrong?" And I said, No, you were not wrong, because I want you to tell me what you feel, what you think. But ultimately, as the author, I have to make the decision whether or not I'm going to take that advice or not. And So that's, I think, you take all the information, but here's the thing: if you're in a Milford style critique session workshop, and one person says, this confused me, and you look at it and it's not confusing to you and it's not confusing to someone else, you may not need to change that. But if you have 7 people saying, the same thing, then it's going to be something you really have to look at. But ultimately, I agree. It's your story, but if you don't take the time to listen, and what I mean by listen is you really truly open your heart and you say, I'm going to really consider what they say, whether I like it or not. And most of the time, I'm not going to like it, but will it make it better? And how will this change the story? How will this, work out? And many times a good editor is going to, whenever they make those offers of changes and so forth, not only does it make it better there, but it makes it better in several other places in your story. And it also makes the entire piece much better.
Yeah, and going along with you don't always have to listen or have to take your advice. Again, I absolutely adore my editor. I love her, love her, love her. And yes, there are suggestions she makes, or she makes corrections, and I'm like, but what I have learned, and this is going to kind of feed us into the next question. One thing I have learned is occasionally, especially because I like to write about stories that take place in the Appalachians, and I actually like to use certain slang sometimes. And I've learned if I put quotes around it and make it dialogue, then she lets it slide by because dialogue's a different story. So I know that if there's something I really want to keep in the book, I can just put it in quotations and make somebody say it instead of me saying it as the author. So there's your little tip. But so that brings me to my next question: is dialogue. Is less more, or is more better? Is it better to have less dialogue, or do you prefer a lot of heavy dialogue?
I don't think it's a more or less thing. Because if dialogue is well done, you can have more and make it work. In my opinion, I think some of the problems with dialogue is making it realistic, and making it fit the character that's speaking it. Like you said, with slang, or with, if they have some kind of accent, you can put that in there, but you want to be able to know who's speaking just by reading that line of dialogue. Like, the characters. Can you read that line of dialogue and know who it's coming from? Like, make it unique to the character. And also, you want to make sure that people don't speak grammatically correct. So you don't need to make it pristine and grammatically correct, because that's not realistic. That's not how people talk. But then on the other hand too, as a writer, when I've tried to make things realistic, you can also kind of go overboard with that, with adding dialect. It can be too heavy in dialect, or even, you got a character that cusses like a sailor, and you're putting F-bombs in here and there and everywhere because that's how they speak. And the author can say, well, I know somebody that speaks like that, but you got to find a balance. And I think another important thing with dialogue too is to, and some advice I got for my writer side, is that even with dialogue, there needs to be conflict within conversation. Even if it's a couple, besties hanging out, there needs to be some kind of conflict, even if it's just some kind of light disagreement or something. But yeah, I don't think it's a more or less thing. What's that?
Somebody poking jokes at the other.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that simple, or just, it needs to be realistic and fit the characters. So I think it's less of a more or less is better, and more of just doing it well. I don't know.
And
Doing it well.
I tell you, the reason why I asked that question is that question was personally mine. Because I used to hate to write dialogue. I hated it. Number one, I hated to have to write, he said, she said, he said, she said. And I'm like, oh, but I absolutely hated to write dialogue. And my editor was like, Tammy, the dialogue that you've written here is actually really good. Maybe you should add a little more, And so I've been practicing adding more dialogue into my stories. And I have found it's really cool because it literally allows the characters to take the story in their direction. It gives them control to take it where they want to take it. And literally the story moves along a lot better. It seems to flow a lot better. Does in my head anyway.
Yeah, well, dialogue is action, something's happening. But you made a point about dialogue tags. And that's something too that I think authors need to be careful of is having too many dialogue tags. And if your dialogue is fitting your character, you don't always need the dialogue tag because you know who's saying it. So, and there was one a crime author that, multiple awards, and I've just admired his work so much. But then I went to a reading of his, and then I noticed like his dialogue. It was like a line of dialogue. He said, she said, he said, she said, he said. And I didn't even pick up on it until he read his work aloud. And I was like, whoa, it was just a dialogue tag after every section of dialogue. And it pulled me right out of the story.
Right. And that's one thing that my editor mentioned is that, when you're reading something on a text, in a book or on your phone or whatever, when you're actually reading it, your eyes usually just kind of skim over the he said, she said part. Your brain kind of ignores it. But you're right. When you're publicly reading or listening to audio of it, it's very distracting. But so again, as while we're on the subject of dialogue, you mentioned the tags. Do you agree or disagree to where you put he replied instead of he said? Does it help by changing said to something else?
No, for one thing, dialogue, I love, when she said that it's action. Dialogue is showing. And that's the greatest thing about dialogue is you're not telling anything, you're showing 100%. And I would stick with said. You were mentioning this. Said is indivisible, but also if you can get out of using said, listen, there's a difference between what is known as a speech tag and what is known as an action tag. Okay. So in dialogue, one of the great things that you can do is every time someone speaks in dialogue, they get their own paragraph. Okay. So in that paragraph, if you said Tom picked up the whiskey, and then maybe in that same paragraph, where are we going to go? Okay, we didn't need a said or anything in that because it's an action tag, and we know beyond a shadow of a doubt Tom was the one who said this. So the more and more that you can include the action tags, and then also there are times when you can have no one being, neither an action tag or a speech tag, and your reader's going to know who it is. And I love also where she said that, every character should have a different voice. I grew up with 2 or 3 guys, and we were the closest, we literally grew up together, played football. We did all these different things, and not one of us, even to this day, sound like any of the others. And so everyone sounds different. So you can have different things. Maybe one character ends, words that are ing with in apostrophe. It's not cooking, it's cooking. But if you do that, only have one character do that, and we know who it is when we see that. So dialogue is powerful, very powerful. But I agree with too much he said, she said, and so forth. It will drive you crazy. I had a full head of hair before starting editing and seeing so much of that. But again, if you implement more and more action tags, and your life will be much easier, and the life of your editor will be as much as well.
I completely agree with that. One of the things with dialogue that I have had a lot of authors do is they think that they're trying to stay true to, like they're trying to pick up an accent and indicate like the person is speaking in a different dialect or whatever, or even that they're just an educated person. But you really need to be careful when you're trying to relay that in writing, that like read those words out loud, because a lot of the ways that people, in my experience, are trying to do it is that they're just misspelling the word, but the misspelling of the word that they're using still sounds the same. So, and actually that's ended up being kind of funny on some words, because it actually has turned it into another word that they really didn't mean. So that has a different meaning. And when you're publishing in the Christian world, there's certain words you don't want that done with. So, making sure, like I encourage my authors, like, I know that you're trying to get this dialect across, but you're not doing it well. You've got to read it out loud. And if that word is still coming out the same when just by the way you've spelled it, then maybe that's not the word that you are changing into the dialect. Maybe you pick a different word, and I think also a lot of times that there's too much trying to put the dialect in there, and it's so heavy with it that you lose your reader, because they're spending the whole time trying to understand what the heck you're saying. And
I agree. And it goes back to James Gunn. You're pulling them out of the story every single time that you're showing them something that they are trying to decipher, and you don't want that. Good point.
Exactly.
If I could, I've got an epithet that's dear to my heart, and that is, if you're in poetry, they tell you all the time, show, don't tell. And I know that Michael was referring to that. And my rejoinder is always tell, don't explain. That the dialogue is showing, as Michael and Renee, and I think Katie also said, it is telling, but just as you have to be incredibly crafty about the way that you produce the language for showing, you have to be just as cunning with the language of telling. And everybody's been addressing that. The one other thing I would say, though, is everybody's talking about the importance of not losing the reader. And I can't think of who it was, but a famous actor who was in some, very famous dramatic and horror movies said, it doesn't matter to me if the audience is confused. I lose everything in the drama if I have to explain. So as long as there's a good reason for your readers to be momentarily, or even for a long period of time, confused, because they get a resolution of their questions later on. If you can make that work, well, that's a really wonderful overthrow of their expectations, and it produces surprise and a lot of excitement when they figure out what you've been meaning for them to figure out. Anyway, that's it.
I wanted to just add to that. Something Manny said, it just made me think of writing your dialogue with telling, and don't use your dialogue for exposition. Don't use the dialogue to explain things in the story. Because it just doesn't work. It doesn't, I mean, you to a certain extent, but you can't have this long drawn out dialogue piece, because you're having your character explain things to your reader, because it's not good.
Years ago, it was known as an as you know, Bob, is what the term was. And it was back in science fiction, where you had two scientists and they were talking about this particular part of science. And the writer would, in order to explain this to the reader, would have one scientist telling the other one, well, as you know, Bob, the blah, blah, blah. And that's a dead giveaway, and you don't want to do that. As you know, Bob's are good in times. You have two characters, married couple, and the guy sneaks in home at 2:00 in the morning, and the wife starts throwing a fit. You come in here 2:00 every morning. You're drunk and blah blah blah. Well, that's an as you know, Bob, but it also adds to the story, and we learn as much as well. So, and also talking about showing, not telling. I'm a firm believer that you have to tell as well. I teach a class called Show, Don't Just Tell. And because showing and telling work together. And I always think of it as in the class, I came up with this analogy of commentators for football. And one is the play-by-play announcer, and the other one is the color commentator. And the play-by-play person is giving you all of the information that is happening on the field. If you were sitting in the stands, you would experience it yourself. Okay? That's play-by-play. That's also showing. The color commentator, who will give you information as in, he hasn't played this well since, 1984. That's telling. And that's a fan that's sitting next to you in the stands, leaning over and saying this to you. But they work together, and they usually work best when they are accenting each other as well. So I think showing, you definitely want to show your emotions and so forth. Don't tell me that they're angry. Show me. How can you show me what they're feeling? How can you show me what they're going through? Don't tell me those things, because to me, the most important facet about all of this is, as a reader, I want to experience as much of it as I can. And when you're showing me, you're allowing me to experience it. And when you're telling me, you're telling me that I'm not able or capable of doing it for myself. And you're mansplaining aspects of the story, so to speak, in crazy terms there. But I think that they work really well together. I think showing and telling, you have to have both. Look, telling, if you have two characters driving in a vehicle for 10 hours and nothing happens in that ride that moves the story forward or develops either character any more, in that 10-hour drive, please, for the love of God, tell us they drove for 10 hours, and then move on. So
and I'm glad you guys mentioned that. The story I'm in the middle of writing right now, the next chapter is literally going into the uncle telling the father and the daughter to come in the house and I'll explain everything. And I stopped at that point because I'm thinking I set myself up kind of, really bad, because now I've got him walking into the house and sitting down for this long speech about the big family secret. So I'm glad you guys mentioned all of that. So I need to make sure that I don't fall into that to where the whole chapter is just him sitting there telling them the family secret. I need to be able to make sure that I'm showing as well. So thank you for those tips.